The median home on Martha's Vineyard now costs $2.5 million. Over 60% of the houses on the island sit empty most of the year. The workers who cook the food, teach the children, and staff the police department cannot afford to live there. Some sleep in cars, some pitch tents in the woods, some couch surf from friend to friend all summer long. And this island, this place that has priced out its own community, only became famous because a Hollywood production designer missed a ferry. He was headed to Nantucket. A snowstorm turned his boat around. He bought a new ticket to Martha's Vineyard instead, walked through the streets of Edgartown, and said, "This is the perfect place for a monster to destroy." He was right. He just had the wrong monster. That man was Joe Alves, and the movie he was scouting locations for was called Jaws. It was late 1973, and Universal Studios had just bought the film rights to a novel that hadn't even been published yet. Peter Benchley's thriller about a killer great white shark terrorizing a beach town. The budget was small. There was no location scout on the payroll. It was just Alves, driving from place to place, looking for a fictional New England beach town called Amity Island, a quiet little resort community where a great white shark would terrorize the tourists. Peter Benchley, the author, had suggested Nantucket, where his family had summered for generations. But the weather had other plans. Alves boarded the ferry at Woods Hole, the captain got halfway across Nantucket Sound, and the seas were too rough to continue. They turned around. The Martha's Vineyard ferry, only 8 miles away, was still running. Alves exchanged his ticket. What he found when he stepped off that boat would change the fate of an entire island. Edgartown, with its brick sidewalks, white clapboard houses, black shutters, and tucked-away harbor, looked exactly like the kind of orderly, pretty, unsuspecting town you'd want a shark to rip apart. The surrounding waters were shallow, with a sandy bottom that never dropped below 35 feet for miles offshore. That mattered enormously, because the mechanical shark had to operate near the ocean floor while the camera pointed toward open horizon, creating the illusion of deep and dangerous water. Alves convinced the director, a 27-year-old kid named Steven Spielberg, and the studio agreed. Martha's Vineyard would become Amity Island. But to understand what they were about to transform, you have to understand what the vineyard actually was in 1974. And it was not what people imagine today. Martha's Vineyard was a quiet place. Work was scarce outside of July and August, and even the summers didn't bring the kind of crowds that come now. The island had 6 small towns, a year-round population of around 6,000 people, and an economy that ran on fishing, farming, and a modest tourist season that kept things afloat but never overwhelmed the place. A man named Steve Ewing, who grew up on the Edgartown waterfront, remembered the island of his childhood in the 1960s. Everybody was poor, he said. Nobody could afford to go off-island. But in 1964, his father, making less than a carpenter, bought a house on Upper Main Street for $12,000. It was simple, a small town, classic Norman Rockwell stuff. $12,000 for a house on Martha's Vineyard. Hold that number in your mind. It's going to become important. The island is old, far older than the white clapboard houses and the ferry docks suggest. The Wampanoag people, specifically the Aquinnah Wampanoag, have lived on Martha's Vineyard for thousands of years. An Englishman named Bartholomew Gosnold is credited with naming the island in 1602, and English settlers arrived by the mid-17th century. Edgartown and Tisbury, the 2 original towns, were incorporated in 1671, named for Edgar, a son of James II of England. A Wampanoag man named Hiakomes became a partner in founding churches across the island's indigenous communities, and for a long time the 2 cultures coexisted in something closer to collaboration than the violent displacement that defined so much of American colonization. The Wampanoag are still here. Their ancestral lands at the western end of the island, in Aquinnah, remain theirs. But the island's first economic golden age belonged to the whalers, and it was enormous. In the early 1800s, Edgartown was one of the most important whaling ports in the world, Ships from every ocean harbored there. The town's deep, protected harbor made it a critical point for clearance papers and customs dues, a gateway for the entire American whaling industry. Vineyard-born captains at the peak commanded roughly 150 New Bedford whaling vessels, nearly a fifth of America's entire fleet. By 1850, about half the island's male population went to sea. The Vineyard Gazette once noted that Martha's Vineyard supplied more whaling captains and whalemen, in proportion to its population, than any locality on Earth. And the captains who came home rich built accordingly. North Water Street in Edgartown became a procession of grand Greek Revival mansions, gleaming white facades, Doric columns, elaborate cornices, with widows' walks perched on top where captains' wives watched for returning ships. The popular name Widow's Walk is actually a misnomer. They were originally designed for dumping sand down chimneys to prevent house fires. But the name stuck because enough captains never came back that the romance and the grief became the same thing. More than 100 of those captains' homes went up in a single boom decade between 1835 and 1845. Captain Abraham Osborne built his house on South Water Street and ran a fleet out of New Bedford. One of his ships, the Okmulgee, met a dramatic end during the Civil War, approached by a vessel flying British flags that turned out to be a Confederate raider. Captain Valentine Pease, whose Greek Revival house still stands, captained the Acushnet, the very ship on which a 21-year-old named Herman Melville sailed in 1841. Melville is widely believed to have based Captain Ahab partly on Pease. And a man named Daniel Fisher, who owned a fleet of whaling ships, became at one point one of the wealthiest individuals in the young United States. His house, one of the finest examples of federal architecture on the island, is open to visitors to this day. The longest whale hunt on record, the ship Nile, was out for 11 years. 11 years on the water. A successful voyage could make a crew member $500. A bad one might pay $10. The stakes were extraordinary. But when the ships came home with holds full of whale oil and blubber, the money flowed directly into the streets of Edgartown, into those white houses, into the church, into the harbor. But whaling collapsed in the second half of the 19th century. Petroleum replaced whale oil. Kerosene was cheaper, easier, and didn't require risking your life in the Pacific for a decade. The grand houses stayed, but the money dried up. Edgartown went to sleep. The captain's mansions passed to more modest owners. The harbor that had welcomed ships from around the world grew quiet. But the whaling era left behind something besides architecture. Whaling vessels had picked up crew from ports around the globe, and many of those sailors came from the Azores. Gradually, Azorean, Portuguese, ancestry entered the island's bloodstream, bringing names like Silva and Madeiros that are still common on the Vineyard today. The island has always been more diverse than people assume. It has always been layered. What woke it up, slowly, gently, was something entirely different. In 1835, a Methodist named Jeremiah Pease and 6 men from the Edgartown church secured a half-acre of land in what would become Oak Bluffs and pitched 9 canvas tents. They held a camp meeting that August, and it was hugely popular. By 1855, worshipers had set up 200 tents. By 1860, an estimated 12,000 people attended a single Sunday service. And then, something remarkable happened. During the Civil War, canvas became hard to come by, so the campers started building small wooden cottages where their tents had been. Local carpenters turned them into tiny works of art, pointed arches, elaborate scroll work, paint in every color imaginable, bubblegum pink, aquamarine, lavender, mint green. The carpenter Gothic style. The gingerbread cottages. More than 300 of them survive today, clustered around the iron tabernacle that was erected in 1879. Meanwhile, surrounding the campground, the town of Oak Bluffs grew up. It was originally called Cottage City and didn't incorporate separately from Edgartown until 1880. A secular development company staged the first illumination night in 1869, hanging decorative paper lanterns from every cottage and setting off fireworks, a tradition that continues to this day, every August. By 1876, a platform carousel was installed on Circuit Avenue. The Flying Horses, now the oldest operating platform carousel in America and a National Historic Landmark. Grab the brass ring on the outer horses and you ride again for free. That tradition has survived for 150 years. Oak Bluffs became something more than a religious community. In the late 19th century, it became one of the only resort destinations in New England that welcomed African-American vacationers. The community grew deep roots. By the mid-20th century, about 50 black families summered in the Oak Bluffs Highlands every year, generation after generation. A woman named Olive Tomlinson, whose mother helped organize the historic Shearer Theater, remembered the non-winterized homes of her friends, the clothes constantly line-drying outside because nobody had dryers, the walks to the Inkwell Beach, the wild berries, the unpaved roads. She remembered the paddle boats in Lake Anthony. They were inexpensive, she said, environmentally correct, safe, wonderful. The Vineyard was quaint, she said, and the paddle boat sums it up. That was the island. Fishermen and farmers and carpenters and teachers, harpoon fishermen and electrical linemen, as the Gazette put it. An island dependent on a seasonal economy, but not overwhelmed by it. Islanders waited in line at Kronig's Market alongside the opera singer Beverly Sills and sniffed the playwright Lillian Hellman's cigarettes. James Taylor showed up in the early 70s and started playing music. Carly Simon was photographed on a tractor. That People magazine picture probably did more to advertise the Vineyard than anything that came before it. But the celebrities who came were not treated as spectacles. They were neighbors. Nobody made a fuss. That was the deal. You could be famous and invisible here. Nobody locked their cars. Nobody locked their houses. You could hitchhike from one end of the island to the other, and somebody would always pull over. The Edgartown annual town budget in 1964 was $400,000. The entire operating cost of an entire town on an entire island, less than what a single house near the harbor would sell for decades later. There were 2 or 3 grocery stores, a post office, 2 barber shops, 1 retailer that sold fancy stuff and closed for winter. The police station was in the town hall. The fire station was where the visitor center would later go. Everything downtown, everything low-key. Steve Ewing remembered his class of 20 kids at the Edgartown school. 1st grade through 8th, everybody came home for lunch. The high school was upstairs. In 1969, something happened that put the island's name in headlines for the first time. Ted Kennedy drove off the Dyke Bridge on Chappaquiddick. The scandal drew enormous attention. But the real shift, the one that changed the physical character of the island, had actually been building for years. Ferry traffic had been climbing steadily since the 1940s. By the time Chappaquiddick happened, 30,000 more cars per year were crossing the Sound than a decade earlier. The island was already being discovered. And then, 1 year after Chappaquiddick, the first jet planes landed on Martha's Vineyard. Everything, as the Gazette put it, sort of took off from there. But the jets didn't make the island famous. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. What made Martha's Vineyard famous, permanently, irreversibly, globally famous, was what arrived in the spring of 1974. A 28-year-old director, a broken mechanical shark, and a film crew that turned this quiet island into a movie set for an entire summer. Jaws was supposed to take 55 days to shoot. It took 159. The budget doubled from $4 million to $8 million. The mechanical shark, 3 separate machines actually, nicknamed Bruce after Spielberg's lawyer, kept breaking down in the salt water. The crew called the production Flaws. There were people on the island who didn't want them there. A screenwriter named Carl Gottlieb later said there were a lot of residents who didn't want to see a big, sloppy film crew tying up traffic. But the island was in the middle of a recession. The country was in the middle of a recession, and the film's reported budget of $3.5 million, over $22 million in today's money, was being spent right there on the Vineyard, much of it going directly into local pockets. Extras earned up to $150 a day. Local carpenters built the sets. A Chilmark farmer named Ozzie Fisher was offered a role, but turned it down to keep running his farm. A local photojournalist named Jeannie Poole was hired to help with casting and ended up casting much of the movie. The island's own people became the movie's texture. 400 locals showed up to be extras in the 4th of July beach scene at State Beach, where a crew of 40 used megaphones to give cues. Local fishermen and boat hands kept watch on the production's fleet of more than a dozen mismatched vessels, including a tug called the Whitefoot, the old City of Chappaquiddick ferry, and a barge that the crew christened the SS Garbage Sail. A man named Kenny Ivory drew night security duty on the barge, and on his very first shift, the thing dragged its anchor and drifted a mile out to sea with him and his bloodhound Moses aboard. When the day crew arrived the next morning, Ivory never mentioned the drift. Quint's fishing shack was built in the tiny harbor village of Menemsha, modeled after the old Sculpin Gallery in Edgartown. The production designer found a 30-foot retired lobster boat and transformed it into the Orca, Quint's vessel, the boat that would carry 3 men to hunt the shark and never bring all of them home. Craig Kingsbury, an island farmer and fisherman, played the small but pivotal role of Ben Gardner. Robert Shaw, who played Quint, modeled part of the character on local fisherman and lobsterman Craig Murphy, who died in 2017, one of the real men of the sea who gave the fictional shark hunter his salt and his edge. A local carpenter named Marty Milner served as foreman of set construction for local hires. He recruited workers at the Square Rigger Bar in Edgartown, where the Vineyard Gazette staff went drinking every Thursday after putting the paper to bed. It became a meeting place. A woman named Kanta Lipsky, who had come to the island in the early 70s and picked up her first painting job from a man wearing nothing but clay on a nude beach, signed on to work construction for the film. It was a time of so much opportunity, she remembered. The whole production had a scrappy, improvisational quality that reflected the island itself, a place where everybody did a little of everything, where the line between work and life was thin, where you might be a carpenter and a farmer and a movie extra in the same week. The production transformed Edgartown into Amity. Blocked-off streets, semi-trucks parked along the beach, people building and unbuilding sets everywhere you turned. Canvas cabanas went up on State Beach. A billboard reading "Amity Island welcomes you" appeared in Aquina. The disruption was enormous. But when it was over, the crew packed up and the island went back to being the island. For about a year, Jaws opened on June 20th, 1975. It opened on over 400 screens, an unprecedented wide release for its time. It grossed $14 million in its first week alone. The film cost $8 million to make. Within 2 weeks, it had turned a profit. By September, it had become the first movie in history to gross over $100 million, passing The Godfather as the highest-grossing film ever made. Eventually, its worldwide take reached $470 million, equivalent to roughly $2.5 billion in today's dollars. It sat at number 1 at the box office for 14 consecutive weeks. A Gallup poll found that 21% of Americans had seen it by summer's end, with another 15% planning to. The term summer blockbuster was literally invented to describe it. And suddenly, everyone in America knew what Martha's Vineyard looked like. Not just knew the name, they had seen it. They had been there, in a theater seat, for 2 hours. They knew the white-clapboard houses, the brick sidewalks, the harbor, the ferry pulling into dock, the beach where the shark attacked that little boy on the raft, State Beach between Edgartown and Oak Bluffs. The bridge that connected the two towns, the one kids jumped off of, the one the shark swam under, now universally called the Jaws Bridge, as if it had never had another purpose. The fishing village of Menemsha, with its weathered docks and lobster traps, where Quint lived in a shack that smelled like fish guts, and was decorated with the jaws of every shark he'd ever killed. Every single frame of that movie was an advertisement for this island, broadcast to hundreds of millions of people around the world. And the advertisement said, "This is the most beautiful, most charming, most quintessentially New England place you've ever seen. Come here. Come find it. Come see if it's real." And they came. Jaws Fest in 2005 drew over 1,000 people to a 30th anniversary screening in Vineyard Haven's Owen Park alone. The 50th anniversary in 2025 was a summer-long celebration. People travel from around the world to walk in Chief Brody's footsteps. They call themselves fanatics. They jump off the Jaws Bridge. They take selfies at the ferry landing. They drive out to Menemsha to stand where the Orca was docked. The Martha's Vineyard Museum has built entire exhibitions around the film. Guided Jaws tours run all summer. The island didn't just appear in the movie, it became the movie. The deep irony, the one that sits at the center of this entire story, is that the plot of Jaws is about a beach town where a shark threatens to destroy the tourist economy. The mayor of Amity fights to keep the beaches open because the town depends on summer visitors. The whole dramatic tension of the film is built on the fear that if word gets out about the shark, the tourists will stop coming and the town will die. On the real island, the opposite happened. The movie didn't scare people away, it drew them in. And the thing that eventually destroyed the working community of Martha's Vineyard wasn't a shark, it was fame. The change didn't happen overnight. It built through the late 1970s and the 1980s, compounding year after year. Proposals for subdivisions started appearing as developers bought up land all over the island. Their names, Cranberry Acres, Deer Run, Mattakesset, sounded like suburban Connecticut. And for the off-islanders buying the homes, that was exactly the point. New homes went up at a rate of roughly 700 per year. Real estate values climbed. The island historian, Bao Van Riper, described it as the moment when people collectively woke up and realized that if they didn't start doing something, the wagon was going to tip over the top of the hill and go careening down the other side, and they'd never be able to control it. The islanders fought back, hard. They blocked McDonald's from coming to Vineyard Haven in the famous 1978 Sack the Mac campaign. They killed a proposed 55,000-square-foot mall and supermarket development in the 1980s. They created the Martha's Vineyard Commission in 1974, a first-of-its-kind regional planning agency with unusual powers to control development. They founded the Martha's Vineyard Land Bank in 1985, funneling 2% of every real estate transaction into land preservation. They fought subdivision after subdivision, and they preserved a great deal. The gingerbread cottages were protected. The captain's houses were maintained. Felix Neck went to the Audubon Society. The Flying Horses Carousel, the oldest operating platform carousel in America, running since 1876, was placed on the National Register. But preservation has a paradox baked into it. Every acre you save, every historic building you protect, every chain store you block, every piece of the island's character you keep intact. You also make the island more desirable, more exclusive, more expensive. The very things that made Martha's Vineyard worth saving made it worth buying. And the people with the most money to buy were not the fishermen and carpenters and teachers who had lived there for generations. Remember that $12,000 house Steve Ewing's father bought in 1964? A house on Martha's Vineyard today sells for a median of $2.5 million. And that's the median, the middle. In 2025, 2 properties sold for $37 million each. One of them, a harborfront estate in Edgartown, with over 16,000 square feet, a deep-water dock, a swimming pool, and a bowling alley in the basement. A bowling alley in the basement, on an island where people used to camp in tents. Then the 1990s arrived, and they brought change with a capital C. It stood for Clinton. Rose Styron, whose family had bought a house on the Vineyard Haven Harbor for $75,000 in 1965, was part of a social circle of intellectuals, writers, and Washington types who came to disappear for the summer. People who played tennis, held late-night card games, and went fishing. It was almost like a secret, she said. Lovely, peaceful, not crowded at all. A wonderful, sleepy little island. And then the Clintons came, and it became a destination. The first visit was arranged through Catherine Graham, the Washington Post publisher, who owned a large tract of land in West Tisbury. The Clintons stayed at former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara's house. When Styron and Graham went to inspect the place beforehand, they found it looked like a camp. McNamara lived out of a backpack. There was barely any furniture, brown quarry tiles in the bathroom, wooden countertops. The bedrooms had sleeping lofts, and the entire south section of the house had enormous glass windows with no curtains. The Secret Service needed blinds. Who can make curtains in a week? Styron and Graham readied the house for the President of the United States and his enormous entourage in 5 days. And then Clinton arrived and immediately drew the entire world's attention to Martha's Vineyard. There was no such thing as Bill Clinton going quietly for ice cream, not with the guy who carries the nuclear codes waiting in the sand dunes, and a SWAT team in the trees, and an 18-wheeler satellite truck following along to beam the footage to every television in the country. The Clintons, even more than Chappaquiddick, even more than Jaws, put Martha's Vineyard on the international radar, Van Riper said. It was the first time the island had a celebrity visitor who just by their presence radically altered the rhythms of life. Every place the president went became a public event, and every image from those vacations was another advertisement. Martha's Vineyard, where the president goes. Just before the Clintons arrived, other infrastructure changes had quietly amplified the pressure. Interstate 495, which provides highway access to Cape Cod, was pushed all the way through to the Bourne Bridge in 1987, making it vastly easier for Boston and New York drivers to reach Woods Hole. The Steamship Authority retired smaller vessels and replaced them with bigger ones. More cars, more passengers, more people. The Clintons brought a new kind of buyer to the island, one who preferred landing by private jet over docking by ferry, one who wanted the comforts of their mainland life while being as far from it as possible. The houses got bigger, the hedges got higher. Where people had once bought cottages and painted them themselves, the new arrivals wanted turnkey mansions with pools, air conditioning, indoor showers, and privacy. Longtime real estate agent Julie Flanders watched the change happen in real time. The vineyard became a trend, she said, and that was a shock and a wake-up call. Then the Obamas arrived, and the transformation was sealed. 2 consecutive presidents vacationing on the same island, a generation apart. The Obamas came back nearly every summer, making Oak Bluffs and the surrounding communities their regular retreat. The celebrity gravitational field intensified. Where professors, artists, and writers had once been the typical up-island buyer, people who wanted peace, who wanted a cottage they could paint themselves. A new generation arrived who wanted pools and air conditioning and turnkey luxury. Martha's Vineyard was no longer a secret. It was no longer a place intellectuals quietly disappeared to. It was the island, the most famous summer destination in America, the place where power goes to rest. And the cost of that fame has been staggering. Only 40% of the housing stock on Martha's Vineyard is available for year-round occupancy. The rest are seasonal homes, vacation properties, and short-term rentals. The average vacation rental charges $931 a night. Workers who keep the island running, the restaurant servers, the teachers, the firefighters, the 911 dispatchers, cannot find anywhere to live. A school administrator named Cheryl Taylor described spending significant amounts of time couch surfing with her suitcase in her car, moving 1 or 2 nights here and there with friends on the island. An island housing planner named Laura Silber wrote a report that laid it out in numbers that are hard to argue with. In 2012, 40% of islanders earned less than $50,000 a year. 10 years later, that figure had dropped to 23%. The proportion of people earning over $100,000 nearly doubled. We're losing our year-round residents, Silber said. We're losing our low and moderate income families. We're losing our middle class because we have no housing. The summer population still swells to as much as 10 times the year-round count of 20,000. 200,000 people on a 100-square-mile island, being served by a workforce that can't afford to sleep there. Some seasonal workers live in tents in the woods. Others crowd into shared rooms. It is not uncommon for homeowners to set up tents and trailers on their own properties to house relatives who can't find anything else. Landlords have every incentive to offer short-term leases to year-round residents during the off-season, then turn them out and rent at vastly higher prices to tourists during summer. The average vacation home now rents for roughly $6,500 per week. Help wanted signs are everywhere. Restaurants reduce their hours because they can't find cooks. Auto repair shops stop taking new customers. Veterinarians turn people away. The island can't retain correctional officers or 911 dispatchers, and officials have publicly worried that public safety is being compromised. The fishing fleet that once stacked boats 2 and 3 deep at Menemsha's wharfs has dwindled to a fraction of what it was. The iconic draggers Unicorn and Quitsa Strider II, fixtures on Dutcher Dock for decades, were sold off in the early 2000s. High costs, strict regulations, climate shifts, and the disappearance of wholesale buyers forced fisherman after fisherman out of the industry. The down-island harbors of Edgartown and Vineyard Haven, which once bristled with working schooners and fishing vessels, are now dominated by fiberglass pleasure boats. And yet, and this is the part that makes the story genuinely complicated, Menemsha itself, the fishing village where Quint's shack was built for the movie, still looks remarkably like what it's always looked like. Lobster traps still stack on the docks. The general store still stands. The harbor still works. It's the one place on the island that the tourism industry hasn't been able to entirely reshape, partly because it falls under the jurisdiction of Chilmark, one of the most fiercely protective of the island's 6 towns. Every evening from spring through fall, people drive out to Menemsha to watch the sunset. They park along the road, they line the beach, they stand on the dock. The sun drops into Vineyard Sound, and for a few minutes the light turns everything gold: the water, the boats, the shingled buildings, the faces of the people watching. It is one of the most beautiful things in New England. It's also the single most perfect distillation of the island's impossible contradiction. The sunset is free, but the house you'd need to live within walking distance of it would cost you millions. The beauty that draws people to this island is the same beauty that has priced out the people who made the island what it was. Every new visitor who falls in love with the authenticity of the place adds another degree of pressure that erodes that authenticity. Every preservation effort that keeps a building historic makes the building more valuable. Every article, every movie, every presidential vacation, every Instagram post that says how beautiful Martha's Vineyard is makes it harder for an electrician or a teacher or a scallop fisherman to stay. The Vineyard Gazette ran an article a few years back that captured the whole arc in its headline: How Martha's Vineyard Grew from Shabby to Chic. The historian Bo Van Riper compared the island to a lobster in a pot. Slowly turn up the water temperature, and the lobster will stay comfortable until it dies. But plunge it into boiling water, and it will jump right out. Nobody on Martha's Vineyard experienced one dramatic, catastrophic moment where everything changed. It was degrees, fractions, a new subdivision here, a bigger ferry there, a celebrity sighting, a magazine cover, a film crew that stayed too long and made the place too famous. And it all traces back to weather on the Nantucket Sound in late 1973. If the seas had been calm that day, Joe Alves would have stepped off the ferry on Nantucket instead. Nantucket would have become Amity Island. The tourists and the fame and the presidents and the $37 million estates, they might have landed there instead. Or maybe nowhere. Maybe the movie would have looked different, felt different, flopped entirely. You can't know. But you can trace the thread. In the movie, there's a famous scene where Roy Scheider sees the shark for the first time. He's shoveling chum off the back of the boat, bored, annoyed, looking the wrong way. And the shark rises up behind him, massive, real, undeniable. He stumbles backward into the cabin and delivers one of the most quoted lines in film history. That line has entered the language as shorthand for the moment you realize the problem is bigger than you thought. The moment you realize you're not prepared. Martha's Vineyard needed a bigger boat a long time ago. It needed a way to absorb the fame, to house the workers, to keep the fishermen on the docks and the teachers in the schools, and the families in the houses their grandparents had bought for $12,000. Instead, the fame just kept coming, and the prices kept climbing, and the working community kept shrinking, one family at a time, until the island that Joe Alves found so perfect, so orderly, so unsuspecting, so ripe for disruption, became something that even he probably couldn't have predicted. Not a place destroyed by a monster, a place consumed by its own desirability. Menemsha at sunset. The boats creak against the dock. The light goes gold. Somewhere behind the shingled fish markets, a lobsterman is hauling his last traps of the day, and a family from Connecticut is photographing the view, and a seasonal worker is wondering where he'll sleep tonight. The sun drops. The crowd applauds. People actually applaud the sunset at Menemsha as if nature had put on a show just for them. Then the light is gone, and everyone drives home. Some of them to mansions, some of them to shared apartments, some of them off the island entirely on the last ferry because they can't afford to stay.